Hello. So welcome everybody today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us today. We have attendees from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States, from the Netherlands to here in the UK, making this a truly global event. I'm Victoria Clark, Commissioning Editor for General Interest and Garden Books here at Phaidon, and I'm delighted to welcome you to The Seasonal Gardener, a conversation across gardens with Anna Pavord, Dan Hinckley and Bill Thomas. We're so thrilled to be partnering on this event with Chanticleer Garden, Windcliff and Heronswood to celebrate Anna's latest book with Phaidon, The Seasonal Gardener, Creative Planting Combinations. Our gardens provide us with constancy and change. They surround us with their familiar landmarks, but at the same time, they excite us with their endlessly shifting elements. The biggest changes, of course, are brought about by the seasonal moves of spring into summer, summer into autumn, and autumn into winter. Anna's new book is about ways of grouping plants in a garden to give you a generous display through those seasons, from the longed-for snowdrops pushing through the ground in late winter, bringing hope for spring, to the vibrant flowerheads of dahlias lighting up a slightly wild autumnal border. In her beautiful new book, Anna has selected 60 star plants, which she pairs with their perfect partners, shrubs, herbaceous perennials, bulbs, and annuals, offering gardeners creative planting solutions to achieve stunning results season by season. It was such a pleasure working with Anna on this book, knowledgeable and passionate about her subject, and with a real talent for the written word. She really is every editor's dream. Anna is a prolific writer on gardens and plants, having published numerous books, including her globally best-selling volume, The Tulip. Her gardening column in The Independent ran for 30 years, and today she writes for the Sunday Times and is an associate editor at the UK's Gardens Illustrated magazine. She lives in West Dorset, where she gardens on a steep, sunny slope among poppies, ferns, and spurges. She's joined today by Dan Hinckley, a plantsman, garden writer, and plant explorer who has had an interest in botany and gardening from childhood, having established Heronswood Garden in the 80s. Today, Dan's energy and passion for plants and gardening is enjoyed in his own 6.5-acre garden on the Kitsap Peninsula in Washington State. And last but not least, our third guest is Bill Thomas, who is head gardener and executive director of Chanticleer, a 35-acre pleasure garden about half an hour west of Philadelphia. Previously at Longwood Gardens for 26 years, he has been leading the creative team at Chanticleer since 2003. After today's conversation, there will be a 10 to 15 minute audience Q&A, so please do drop any questions you might have into the chat. And I'll now turn over to our wonderful speakers. Thank
you. Well, thank you very much, Victoria. And I have to say that's the first book that I've ever done without ever seeing my editor or anybody. Doing everything sort of long distance is really quite a funny thing. I'm used to hammering things out round a table and arguing, but we had to be very polite with each other, and we were. And we've only met twice. It seems nuts. But anyway, I'm so grateful to both Bill and to Dan for joining in this discussion, because I remember wonderful trips to Chanticleer some years ago when I was doing talks in the States, and the most incredible excitement of actually staying with Dan at the garden he was making at Windcliff. And actually, Dan, I think it works out that you've been at Windcliff about the same time as we've been at what I still call the new garden, because we've only been there 20 years, whereas we were in the other garden for 40. But what I think is really interesting is that we have, because I was able to see that lovely video that is up on the Chanticleer website, 13th of May it was dated, we seem to be pretty much on the same page in terms of what our plants are doing, except Dan, you were saying that it's pretty terrible where you are. Why is that?
Dan, you're muted.
Dan.
Dan
There you go. How's that? Sorry about that. Yes, we've had a very, very extended late winter, not even early spring here, and coldest and really the wettest on record. So we're just a little bit suppressed. On the other hand, it's made things, the spring ephemerals last forever. So it's always, there are always silver linings, and we're enjoying that extended season. But it sure would be nice to have a little warmth and to see your ferns, those ostrich ferns coming up like that. We're dying for that bit of excitement to our retinas here in the greater Puget Sound area, at least.
But Bill, you seem to be actually, I noticed on your video, you had wonderful great swathes of this fern already showing exactly as this picture is, almost fully unfurled.
Ostrich fern loves our environment. And in fact, there are many times where we feel it loves it too much, but it's absolutely stunning. But because of its running characteristic, it can really fill in an area. But it's not too hard to dig out. But in fact, there's one area right now where we're removing some of it. But it's such that we also then plant it. We just move them to some places where we could use a quick fill. But it looks, I've got some just off my patio at my home that gets backlighted in the afternoon, and the light coming through it just as it shows in this photograph is quite beautiful.
It took me a long time to realize that, actually, Bill, that these extraordinary sculptural plants that we love to have in our gardens, and ferns are absolutely at the top of the list as far as I'm concerned, they are much better looked at if you can get that backlight and see them, not exactly in silhouette because we still get the color, but there's something absolutely glorious about having that light coming through them. I couldn't work that out for ages, actually. It just shows how dumb one is as a gardener, how dumb I am as a gardener, that actually it was several years at our old garden where we were for 40 years before I really understood, yeah, actually that's where I need to be planting ferns because that's where the sun travels in the sky.
And I think that's also the thing about gardening is that we keep learning. And I keep telling our interns who are a bit younger than I am that everything gets better as it gets older, and that there is something for experience. They roll their eyes, of course, when I say that. But
the problem I find that with experience comes the inability to actually, keep going quite as you did when you were inexperienced. Then you had wonderful energy and you could dash at things even if you got them wrong. But I think the wonderful thing about ferns is that they are there for such an incredibly long time. I mean, in terms of planting combinations, what you always need is that one plant that can actually go on providing, perhaps it isn't quite such a dramatic background as the ferns provide now when they're unfurling, but it's always there. And it's nice enough to actually, just be a companion for other things that you might put with it. I'm not making any apologies at all for making so many of my plants actually in this book ferns, because, Dan, you say it in your own book, you've just got to think really leaf before you start thinking flower.
Absolutely. I think that's, as Bill said, as we get older, that lesson just becomes more and more important. And, all of us dash to the color spots at the nursery, those seasonal color spots. That's where we're drawn, especially as young gardeners. But as we mature a bit, and admittedly, Bill is much more mature than I am, the importance of foliage just becomes that much more underscored. And, that's my primary aspect in selecting plants is what are they going to do for that 6 months that you're talking about, Anna. And it's if they're deciduous, then you have that fresh new growth like you're talking about that's backlit by the sun. If they're evergreen, they're still dramatic as they're unfurling in spring, but then they're there all winter long. So
Yeah.
absolutely.
What I was trying to do when I was putting together plants, I mean, we all know that actually there are endless combinations that one could put together with your star plants, but we just try and actually hang on to that thing that at least one of those plants is going to go on providing when the others are much more ephemeral. Sometimes we like the grand slam, and this is particularly so. You know, for instance, I'm thinking, you know, of the spring, extraordinary bulbs all coming up and going boom, 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 boom. But actually, most of the combinations that I've put together, most of the threesomes that appear on the pages, will be showing something that is the star, in this case, this marvelous cistus, which is just about to come out in our garden, Cistus cyprius, but Lodanifer is just as good, I think. But you can put with that something that is just going to give you a boost in the summer. Later on, the opium poppies aren't quite coming into bloom yet with us. And one of the umbellifers that we are absolutely mad about over here. Everybody is mad about Ami, about Orlea, about Solinum, about all these sort of things that look like sort of one of our wild plants, which we call cow parsley. But I gather, Bill, perhaps they're not so much used in the States. Is this a sort of style thing, or is this an availability thing?
Well, so first I'd like to just mention that cistus doesn't do well for us. Our
Right.
winters are too harsh for it. But there are lots of white flowered shrubs. You know, some of the shrub roses are coming into bloom right now. Some of the exocorta, which is another shrub in your book. So I always try to not get fixated on things that we can't grow, although we all tend to do that. But we have Orlea and Oriental poppy. I mean, not Oriental. What do I call it?
Opium.
Bagel seed. Well, we try not to say opium. But anyway, we have both of those, and I love how, you know, you can just sprinkle the seed and then edit them out, and we do a lot of that throughout the garden with various self-sowers, and that really gives a strong effect.
I think you're right. And the other thing that self-sowing does is that it teaches you. It shows you where those things actually really want to be, not where you, the gardener, thought they might be happy. But if you use your eyes and actually watch where they're doing best, where they've put themselves, then we can learn from that and perhaps remember when we're next doing it the following year. But I love the poppy tribe, and I've got one astonishing one that I sowed in the autumn, actually, from seed, and set out really rather early this season, but thinking they were outgrowing their pots and I didn't want to pot on again. It's one called Pandora. And I don't know, you know, perhaps there's so many brilliant poppies that you can sow from seed, but this is actually just giving those great punches of red amongst all that spurge that's on the back at the moment. And that brilliant red and the spurge just are incredible, I think. But then, you know, we have to make the most about these outrageous things we can do now, because everything is growing with such oomph, such tremendous energy and enthusiasm. This is a rather wonderful scene done by a very, very talented gardener at Gravetye in Sussex. And he trained at Dixter, and he then went on to sort of work in this garden that is famed over here through being the garden that was made by William Robinson, Edwardian gardener, who sort of very much promoted this style of slightly wild, loose gardening, which I think is infecting us all over here. Is it the same with you in the States?
Well, I think that style has settled in. It's going to be around for a long time. That the idea of those heavily controlled double borders that we are all enamored with so much when the craze of gardening hit here in the early 80s, that that's starting to fade away, and we're all approaching this William Robin-esque style that is more loose, yet still somewhat contrived, I would say. It is friendlier. It's friendlier to the landscape. I think it's friendlier to the garden, and certainly it attracts more pollinators and more wildlife. So yes, as a long way of saying yes, it has happened here, and you certainly see it at Chanticleer, don't we, Bill?
Yeah, I think that's very much our style in many of the areas. And we have, by the Chanticleer house, we have an area we call the Flowery Lawn, which is a really almost a manicured meadow. But we grow tulips and daffodils there in the spring, and then right now Hesperus and then Thriscus are in bloom, and then during the summer months we have some perennials, but we also dot in some annuals, and it really attracts pollinators, bees, butterflies, moths, hummingbirds. And I would like to point out that the head gardener at Gravetype, Tom Coward, also guest gardened at Chanticleer. And so we learned a lot from him, and we hope he took home some things. And we've had a couple other gardeners from there come to and spend some time here.
Well, that's a wonderful link. I didn't know that, Bill. But I'm going to do an event at Gravetype sort of next month, and I think he's an extraordinary boy. I think he's absolutely terrific, and the garden is just flourishing under him. And this is a very, sort of full-on, sort of, you might say, herbaceous planting. But there are plenty of areas still at Gravetype that sound much more like the lawn that you were describing at Chanticleer. And of course, I suppose Dan really from the beginning. That sort of wonderful effect of mingling and sort of not wildness, because of course it's all carefully thought through by you. But I remember just sort of in a haze making my way through Windcliff in the evening. I think you were probably doing supper, or somebody was doing supper. Certainly I was not doing supper, which is a great treat for me. And all this stuff, you sort of seem to be just sort of melding one thing into another. It was a sort of great time for agapanthus then. And I'm very keen on blue. And that blue sort of against your swaying sort of, they weren't pampas grasses, but they were, what were they? Those big things that look a bit like pampas. You have
well, it's the New Zealand pampas. It's now called Ostrodaria rather than Cordaria. Ostrodaria fulvida is probably what you're looking at. But right. I agree. That was my direction when I started Windcliff, is having a place that people could lose themselves into, and invited wildlife back into the garden and the pollinators. And it's still a lot of work, just like all gardeners are. There's that tipping point of wild-esque to just plain wild, but it's certainly what I'm most attracted to now, and I think most of us we're getting to that point.
Well,
less controlled.
Yeah. I think age has got something to do with that. But I think the wildlife aspect is really interesting because, it's very hot on the agenda here, gardening with a regard for all the other creatures that are actually using all this stuff. And, it's not just what we want. It's not just that block of yellow that we see in our mind's eye. It's actually what other creatures are going to be able to make use of that. And I think much of what we do now is actually much more aware of the complexity of what we are doing. And also a very interesting survey that was done at Dixter, which showed that actually a gardened garden is providing just as much resource and attraction for wildlife as, a technically, properly native wild environment will do. And I think that's very reassuring, that we don't have to go out and just, only plant natives. We can plant all these beautiful things and know that they're still, providing what particularly the insects need.
Yeah, I agree. Fergus Garrett did those bio audits, at Great Dixter, as I'm sure you're aware of, and found so many more things in the bounds of Great Dixter than were outside in the agricultural fields. So that's a very good case in point that we are providing habitat and for a whole host of other creatures that we need to invite.
I think the thing, though, about writing a book, you know, sort of such as this one, The Seasonal Gardener, is that you can't but help your own likes and you know, desires to come through. You know, I'm mad about ferns, as I've already confessed, but I'm also mad about iris and all sorts of things. You sort of think, crumbs, there's rather a lot of ferns here, there's rather a lot of iris here, but you know, these Iris sibirica, they're such incredibly good and dependable garden plants, and so much easier than the ones that really are dramatic, the bearded iris, which I also adore, but you know, not so easy to use in mixed plantings. They really don't like having stuff flopping over them. But these Siberian iris, do you use them at all, Bill?
Very much so, and they're a plant that, you know, they bloom for us for 10 days, 14 days, each clump. But then the foliage is very grass-like the whole rest of the season, and they're big, strong clumps, and so they really give some emphasis going back to the foliage aspect, so that it's a species we like for foliage as well as for the flowers.
I think you're absolutely right, because so much of the herbaceous stuff is sort of low and hummocky, isn't it? And all the geraniums that we use, for instance, and you know, sort of, and to have these wonderful sword punctuation marks, you know, pushing up through is a very important part of putting plants together. But you know, it's each to his own. I'm very fond of lilies. Even though this very morning I picked the first ghastly sort of, you know, things that they lay, what do we call them? You know, those terrible grubby things that were coated in muck. I mean, this early, it is only just the beginning of May and the wretched things are already at it. Oh, but still, you can always vent your ire, though, on a lily beetle. You know, crushing a lily beetle is one of those great gestures that one can make as a gardener. And then nothing seems to have actually come through to want to eat it, you know, for breakfast. So I'm waiting for some bird to decide that that bright red speck is actually a very good thing to have as a little sort of amuse-bouche before its main meal. May it happen. Do you get lily people? No, do you grow lilies? I don't remember lilies. Do you have them, Windcliff, Dan?
The species lilies, but my understanding is that if you don't have lilies, they are quite happy with relatives and Pligonatums, Mianthemums, etc., which I do have a fairly large collection of. The lily beetle has not made it across the Puget Sound yet, to my knowledge. We're on the lookout for it. It has been found in the Seattle area, but right now not an enormous problem. I think perhaps our just extended coolness is keeping the population at bay, hopefully. How about you, Bill? Do you have the populations built up there now?
And I hesitate to even say, because we're fortunate right now, I'm knocking on wood, trying to do it quietly. We don't have them here, and we desperately do not want them. And so we have, I think, some really beautiful lilies. We have Lilium formosanum, which gets to be for us over 2 meters high, almost 8 feet tall, with gorgeous, huge flowers, and we grow that from seed. We started from seed because it produces so much seed, but it doesn't seed in for us. But we've been planting quite a bit of it. And then the Martign lilies and some of the other ones for shade, I think have such beautiful foliage.
Those whorls around the stem, they're absolutely terrific. You know, that way that they're placed, you know, so dramatically. I absolutely love the Martign's. And like you, I find they do really well in shade, which is useful. The garden that we had before was an old rectory where we were for 40 years. It was densely shady. And I know people always somehow, you know, grumble about shade, but it was one of the things that was in my mind when I was making this book, to have combinations that actually weren't just all for sort of, you know, bright, sunny, well-drained situations, but were for damp places, such, for instance, as this combination we're looking at now. You know, the royal fern, the yellow iris, the regersea, you know, they all like sort of dampish soil, and, you know, well, we sometimes have to cope with that as well. Now, I gather And who is going to tell me about it all over again? It is you, Dan. Tell me why I should not be growing this yellow iris, which I so love.
Well, that's Iris pseudochorus, and I just pointed out that it is a Class C noxious weed in the Pacific Northwest, and I can see how at Heronswood it really has sown itself through the water, and it will grow in standing water. So it's not quite prohibited in the Washington State yet, but it is discouraged, and I can see why. But I do love it. I have to tell you, those spears of translucent green as they come up in the spring, it's almost opaque at first. It's all about the foliage there. It really is beautiful, but I understand why there's concern about it. But
Yeah.
the royal fern next to it, in my estimation, because I grew up with it in my own backyard in Michigan, when that emerges in spring, it is perhaps the most seductive sight that we have at Heronswood. Just fantastic. And it's forming a fairly large trunk as it ages as well. Quite extraordinary. It looks like a young tree fern or a Dicksonia at times.
I'm so glad you love it, Dan, because I do too. I think in Ireland was where I first saw it. We used to sail a lot, and there's nowhere like the south and west coast of Ireland for sailing. And then we used to go ashore and hire bikes and go speeding down these lanes with ditches alongside, and they would be full of royal fern backed by wild fuchsia, and you'd think, crumbs, what a place is this? And I brought it to the garden that I still call, as I said, the new garden, and it grows very well there. Dorset is a great place for ferns anyway, because it's damp and coolish, and the royal fern, I think, as you do, one of the tops. Although I do love Bevis, and I love it particularly because it was given to me by Christopher. He just took a spade and bumped down into the border of Dorset, carved off this great chunk of Bevis. And actually, I love it too, because it was discovered by an agricultural labourer going home after a hard day's work in a lane near Axminster in Devon. And he was Mr. Bevis, and that's why the fern is called Bevis. Yeah, so I like that too, to think that there was an agricultural labourer, as country people do. They have very, very sharp eyes, but he knew, obviously, and was very fond of his ferns. So Mr. Bevis is much in my mind as I admire this glorious thing. There we are. We're back to foliage, aren't we? Aren't we, Bill? We're back to foliage with all those three plants. We might be talking about their flowers, but actually it's the foliage that actually matters there. We've got that marvelous fern. We've got those incredible great spears of that iris. And then we've got those beautiful hands of the regersias. I mean, the flower doesn't come till much later. There might be people who are wincing on the screen at the yellow and the pink, but this is a combination where the regersia is coming in after the iris is well finished its flowering, and just adding that little sort of bump when it happens in its late summer flowering time. Yeah, the pink won't be showing with the yellow. So you can stop shuddering, anybody who doesn't like that. Christopher loved it, of course, but then he always loved things that were shocking.
I love your story, and just to digress for a moment, that Christo took the shovel and did that for you, because the two plants that I have in my garden from Dixter, including the fern, Asplenium scalopendrium, which has a beautiful, we call it the Dixter form. He handed me the shovel and then stood there in front of me as I took the piece off. So I had a much more terrifying experience than you did, I can assure you.
Oh dear. And what about you, Bill? Where would you put sort of your top fern?
So if we could go back to that, our royal ferns, we have some of those in our native plant woodland, and the hummock that they grow out of, this mound, and in the spring when they come up, it really is sculptural. It is quite wonderful. And then we also have that in our pond area where it's growing right on the edge of a spillway, and that it has just a magical look to it. But I also love the three plants you have here. And Iris pseudacaris is also considered a weed, an invasive exotic in this area, but there are lots of other irises that you can grow to give you that effect. But the foliage contrast that you have in those three, the fern, the very fine textured ferns, the sword-like leaves of the iris, and then the much wider palmately compound leaves of the Rodgersia spreading out like that. I think that's a great combination. And so we've talked about foliage, but also then designing with different foliage textures and also colors is an important aspect.
It is. And how do you go about doing that, Bill, in the garden? I remember Chanticleer with great pleasure about, some years ago when I was sort of doing talks and things in the States. But I understand that you have sort of 8 sort of people who are in charge of separate areas, as it were. And do you sort of have any sort of feeling that, the choice needs to be sort of monitored by you? I mean, how does the thing work? And how do you actually go about keeping that extraordinary excitement of moving from area to area?
So we do it's actually 7 horticulturists or gardeners are their titles, and each one is responsible for doing the design, the planting, and the maintaining of the area. So the same person who is the designer is also the one who's pulling the weeds, and that works beautifully too, in that no one ever comes to me and says the designer came up with some crazy design that can't be grown. And if there are certainly problems, but they make sure that they fix them. And then I see myself as kind of the conductor of an orchestra, and so or a chamber ensemble where each person could be a soloist, but trying to have them work together also. So each area having its own feeling. And so with design, many of them they'll design first with foliage, and they'll do a design that will hold true with its leaves, and then use the flowers as accents, and the flowers come and go. And again, that's a sort of thing that is very difficult to do, but each one of them is an excellent designer. Each one is very creative, and each one knows plants really well. And they're always experimenting. They keep trying new things.
Yeah, that's really important.
Some of the areas are seasonal, or we change them a lot in one year, and then some are primarily perennial.
Mm-hmm. And what about you, Dan? Because you've got this vast plant knowledge because of all your plant hunting. You've been responsible for bringing in the most extraordinary plants. That introducing them. When you go out, or when you were starting at Windcliff, can you remember that time? Can you remember anything other than a general sort of miasma in your mind about what you were trying to do when you were choosing plants? What was in your mind?
Well, riffing off of Bill's comments, we don't have an orchestra here. We have a duo, and I'm the prima donna, and Robert's the manager. But when we first started, I think I still do to this day. And when I set a plant down, I'm not just asking of the plant itself that I'm placing, what it's going to do when, but it's just so important to look in the surrounding 10 square feet of what it's going to be up against. And I'm still finding myself, just yesterday I was planting and realizing, like, why would I possibly think of putting this small evergreen shrub here? Because right in the background was another small evergreen shrub. And so, just as Bill said, the juxtaposition of textures is just so important. And that bold leaf, the bold leaf of the Rodgersia, the bold leaf of Bergenias, of Astilboides, all of those things are the punch oftentimes that a planting needs. It needs that broad boldness in order to play off of the more finely textured things and the upright things, the horizontal next to the vertical.
Yeah. It's really interesting, actually, because, you know, we're gardening in incredibly different places, all of us, and you two are professionals. But you said in your book, Dan, the book about Windcliff, which I so loved, you said at the beginning, when you were talking about plants and their characteristics, you're thinking about texture and foliage, height and movement, seasonality, fragrance, balance, and repetition. Now that's very, very neatly encapsulated. But I think, you know, it's what we all come to. It's what we're all hoping for, is to actually get all those things working. And, you know, as Bill has said, it works particularly, you know, when you understand about foliage, because you get so much of the texture and the movement, you know, sort of through that. But I do love scent as well. I love that moment, you know, when a shrub that I have put into my book, it's that yellow rhododendron. It's not in any way sort of unusual. It's got that gorgeous scent, and the whole of our garden is just filled with that. And it's not just so much, you know, the fact that it's there because it's difficult or rare or splendid or anything, but it's there for its scent, and of course it gives you fantastic autumn color as well. It's the brilliant red. You do autumn color so much better in the States than we do over here, but you know, that azalea, that rhododendron, it gives a most wonderful performance in the autumn. And you know, like we all say about plants, you've got to look at them really hard when you're thinking about whether you want to bring them into your garden or not, and say, well, what do you look like when you haven't got your breast clothes on? You know, we've really got to be quite harsh in our judgment of them. And certainly that is one of the things that, you know, it's so difficult to stick your sort of marker on a scent. You know, when you try and describe it, if you're a writer, you know, you can go on for 600 words and never actually nail it. It's so evanescent. And I think it changes with the weather as well. But it is certainly something that is, you know, one of the most gorgeous, hovering extra elements you get in a garden. You could, sometimes I think I could navigate through my garden just by the scent. I could shut my eyes and feel my way through it and know where I was just by what I was smelling. I'm very, very keen on scent, and particularly keen on that completely narcotic scent that is just about to come from Magnolia wiesneri, which is one of those things, one of those miracles of the plant kingdom that, you know, I'm glad that I actually migrated for the first time off clay and onto this soil that we call here green sand, that is just on the acid side of neutral, and to be able to indulge in a last great passionate love affair with magnolias. Oh boy, that is a good moment to be able to do that. So that's where this new garden is actually taking me. And yeah, I'm just thinking it'll be really funny actually when we're dead and gone and this place has gone back into the chaos and the undergrowth and the, you know, sort of non-garden that it was when we came. Somebody will hack their way once again through the brambles and everything, and they'll come across these great species magnolias, and they'll say, who in this ridiculously remote West Dorset Valley ever planted these magnolias? Because they will still be going on. And that's actually rather a wonderful, wonderful thought, isn't it? That these trees will be going on, pulsating there in West Dorset of all places. You will have seen them in the wild, of course, Dan. Still.
That's beautifully put, Anna. I mean,
Well,
I love listening to you. You would just continue talking and just let us listen. That would be
no, because you two have the knowledge, and that's what people want. If we can't see the people that have clocked into this thing, which, you know, you two are stars in America, and you two and your gardens will be well known to people. So it is your knowledge and your expertise that people will be wanting. So yeah, who comes to West Dorset? Nobody, which is part of the reason why it's so lovely. Oh, well, yeah, and this is another thing, actually. I didn't know these wonderful great tree peonies until quite recently, and this one, Peony de Lavii, is one that I've grown to be supremely fond of. the foliage is absolutely fantastic. I would grow those tree peonies and those intersectionals that are now coming into the market, crosses between the herbaceous peonies and the tree peonies, just for their foliage, those amazing shades of bronze you get when they first leaf up in the spring. And then de Lavii produces this rather recessive, sort of deep, dark, mysterious flower, scented again, very difficult to describe how, but I think this is a real beauty. And I have 3 of them now because it very sort of nicely produces suckers that you can actually dig up with enough root to move somewhere else. And so it's been migrating. Do you grow it? Is it easy for you in the States? Bill, do you have it?
We don't have it here. We do have intersectionals. I don't think we have it here anyway. And we also have a number of tree peonies. The tree peony, and you talked about the foliage and the importance of foliage on peonies, and it's often they'll only bloom for about 5 days for us.
Yeah.
And so you do have to think of the foliage when you're planting them. But I love them when they first come out, and the rest of the season the foliage is strong.
Yes. Well, the peony here is my star plant because the book has got 60 star plants and then the others are the outriders. But as you say, the flower is a very short-lived thing. The foliage will stay, but to give an extra boost, I've put in these 2 sort of things that won't come on until late summer. So that is actually often part of the thinking of these combinations that, you just want another little excitement at another stage in the year. So it's a thrilling business. And of course, next year we might think of other combinations and, start. And because constantly being able to try new things each year is one of the huge joys of gardening. Wouldn't you agree? If something fails, you can say, oh, well, perhaps next year it'll do better. There's always another season. And also, there is always another season in the sense that we live in countries which are lucky enough to have very clearly demarcated seasons. And so when this glorious spring and late spring season is coming to an end, we don't have to feel sad because there is so much else to come, and it will be different and it will be exciting and it will be wonderful. It's been so great to be with you two. I've so enjoyed this session with you, and I feel very honoured and privileged that we've been able to talk together in this way. Thank you so very, very much for giving up your time for this. And I hope if you come to England that you will come and wander in West Dorset.
Well, as long.
Thank you all. That was absolutely amazing. I honestly could go on listening to you talk about plants and your gardening experiences all evening or morning, day. Sadly, we have limited on time and we do have a few questions. So question number 1, Tony asks, how do you transpose your triptych combinations to a more naturalistic matrix planting design where the quieter matrix base of the planting is key to orchestrating multi-seasonal harmony? Is this discussed in the book?
Tangentially, I don't think I use the word matrix. No, I don't think I do.
No.
Victoria would know. She was my editor, but I don't remember using it. I don't think I've ever signed on to any particular style. That's, part of one. Matrix planting has been much talked about as a style and something that you do. And so I don't think I'm very well, perhaps I'm perhaps not the right person to try and answer this. What about you, Bill? What about you, Dan?
Well, and actually, I think you do cover that essentially in the book, Anna, but not necessarily exactly how that's being said. But you show plants that can work together, either to give you a big bang all at once with all 3 blooming at once, or through the seasons, something that will keep blooming in the same spot together, and they'll work together. And that can be done really in any style. It could be what people call a formal style, where you have everything symmetrical, or you have them, or it can be in a cottage-like style or a very relaxed planting. It's the concept of how you use foliage, how you use flowers together to give you interest throughout the year, throughout 12 months. So I think you cover it just beautifully. So to me, the answer to the question is yes, that's covered in the book.
Hooray! Thank you, Phil.
Question number,
I thought I was
question number
there.
2, which I think actually you could all possibly answer, is Sasha asked, what is your favourite surprise to find in a garden scene?
Oh, Dan.
I will say finding a self-sown seedling that I would never have expected to come from any one plant in my garden. I find that to be thrilling. Just this weekend, I found a self-sown opuntia or cactus for the first time ever in my life in my garden, which I thought, how does that happen in the Pacific Northwest? So that's a thrill for me.
And to me, I have the glorious aspect of my job is that I'm out in the garden 2 or 3 times a day. And to me, there's a surprise every day I walk around. Now, part of it is that the gardeners have done something, they've moved things around, but also that there's something that's coming to bloom. So like Dan's mentioning, it could be a seedling that I didn't know was there, but really just something that's come up and is coming to bloom, or something that's backlighted. It's to me, you want your garden to be filled with surprises. We're all gardening for ourselves, essentially. We like to share it with other people, but if we're not happy with our own garden, then what's the point? And so we should get pleasure out of it. And that can sometimes be something that you can eat, that, a berry that's ripened and it's, you get to eat it because it's your garden.
What about you, Anna?
I think probably it's in the bulb department, because the thing about bulbs is you so often plant them in the autumn and then you forget that you've planted them. And I mean, I would have written it down somewhere. I do keep a fairly good sort of planting book of everything that I'm putting in, but it doesn't stay in my mind. And part of the problem of writing it down is that you don't bother to keep it in your mind. And then particularly with species tulips, which I, grow far more than any other sort, suddenly this amazing thing will come up and you thought, I don't remember ever putting that in. At the moment, it's these extraordinary late Sprengeri tulips, absolutely outrageous things, beautifully made with very, very pointed petals and glorious red sort of coated on the outside with a sort of ambery yellow. And I think, oh, you beauty. Thank you very much for stretching the elastic and deigning to grow in soggy old West Dorset rather than where you want to be in Kazakhstan. Thank you very much. I always say thank you because, well, I'm really, really, really pleased that they've survived.
And Elizabeth asks, deer don't care what season it is. They seem to eat everything. Fences aren't permitted in our community. Suggestions from you all, or just condolences?
Are dogs permitted in the community? that might be the answer. But I've found that when deer are hungry, they're going to sample everything. All those things that have been declared deer proof are still going to be sampled, if not totally eaten. So the damage is going to happen. That's my perspective. I have to tell you that I don't have a lot of deer pressure in my garden. So my answer is probably as cavalier as it sounds. So sorry about that. I think Bill might have more of a problem, but I know he is fenced as well.
So Chanticleer is fenced, and that allows us to do the wonderful plantings that we do. But I live on the property, but outside of the deer fence, or at least half of the garden around my house is not fenced. And frankly, I think if there's nothing you can do about the deer, if there's no culling that's being done, and you're just putting up with it, I don't like fences, individual fences around plants, although sometimes you might do that with a tree that you want to get started, because generally a tree will reach a certain point that the deer won't bother it. They won't rub it. They won't eat it. But otherwise, it's keep trying, growing, and what they don't eat, plant more of it, and don't get too upset if they're with what they eat, and just try something else. Sometimes containers, if you're talking about vegetables too, or sometimes containers with anything, you can put them right next to your front door, which they may be less inclined to come up to. And so there may be areas of your garden that the deer are less likely to eat, just because you're walking there more often, or you have a dog, or your neighbors have a dog that comes over and visits. So it's really getting to know your garden and seeing what can grow. But I've never felt that there's any reason to keep trying something that is not succeeding. But there are lots of plants out there, lots of things that you can grow.
And Anna, do you suffer with deer?
No, but we've got some very good poachers around us, so that might be the reason why. There was a fashion actually for hanging hanks of human hair around one's garden. That was thought to be something of a deterrent, but it's something a bit sort of curiously spooky about that sort. So I've never tried it. No, so far
I have tried that.
No. Dan, you would not be able to contribute much. We cannot pretend otherwise. Your dogs are.
So we have a fourth question from Mimi, who asks, "What gardens are you most hoping to visit in the world?"
Gosh, well, I tell you, the one garden that I was absolutely blown away by, and I have been there several times already, so perhaps it's a bit of a cheat to mention it again, but I absolutely adored Lotus Land. I thought it was fantastic. I was just, that first sight of those vast, great euphorbias growing against that wall, I never knew euphorbias could do that. And there's something about that woman who made it and the number of husbands she worked through while she was making it. And she was quite a character. And I liked the sort of her too, pushing on and, somehow just having a vision somehow that was so strong and so sort of Hollywood in a curious way, which is, typical because it's not very far away from that. But I thought it was glorious. So, of course, there are plenty of other gardens that, I would love to go to. But I think revisiting a garden is always exciting because you see different things you didn't see before.
Mm-hmm. And Dan and Bill, do you have a garden to visit?
Well, I haven't seen Anna's yet, so that's on the list. And there's a new garden in Hokkaido in Japan, relatively new, called the Millennial Project. Dan Pearson's been working on that, and it's a garden with a 1,000-year master plan. So I'm very anxious to see that.
Bill?
And I'd say just the list is too long, and it depends on wherever you're going to go. And I'm going to come out to the Seattle area with some of the Chanticleer's board members in September, and we're I've strong-armed Dan into having us invade Windcliff, and I'm very excited about that. I've been there before. I also have not been to Anna's garden, but I definitely noted that she has now invited me, and so I am planning to get there. I'd say it's wherever you go, try to find out what the gardens are, and allow yourself some time. So if you love the garden, go more slowly. If you find you really don't like the place, go through it quickly and go on to the next one.
So time for one final question, which is for Anna. What do you hope readers will take away from your book?
That's a really interesting question because, each person will be programmed perhaps to, home in on different things. But what I hope that they will take away from it is that this is an adventure, this is thrilling, this is something where you don't have rules. I mean, the problem is with new gardeners, they long for a rule. If we do A and B, then C will follow, but it isn't like that. The great thing is to use your eyes, to watch, to absolutely take note of what the plants are trying to tell you. And if you're constantly looking and constantly just writing, little notes down, I think you do become much more sort of, I don't know, less intent on your own ideas and more receptive to what other things might be possible. So I think an open mind is what I hope people take away from my book. Of course, I hope they might like some of the combos and think, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that, might try that. Yeah, of course you hope that they will take things away and actually find those useful. But actually what you want really is for them to think, crumbs, never thought of that. Oh, crumbs. And just constantly sort of be mulling different things around, different possibilities.
Mm.
Lovely. Well, thank you, Anna and Dan and Bill for this wonderful conversation. And thank you all for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we did. I think there's an offer code posted on the chat, but you can keep enjoying and learning through reading Anna's book, The Seasonal Gardener, which is available at your local bookstore and online at phaidon.com. And we hope you've enjoyed today's conversation. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. And thank you very much to Dan and Bill. Thank you so much. Goodbye from England.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.